The Myth of Jesus with David Fitzgerald.
I wanted to, personally thank you for returning. I mean, we must have done something right. And I was actually spending a little bit of time in the comment section of the video that we posted. And the first one was really good. The second one was really good. I'm going to read the third one. It says, from Cat Woods, "This is fascinating. What I don't understand is why, if they're going to sit down in Alexandria and write these stories, they took two conflicting versions and put them together patchwork style so that it's impossible to come up with consistent history between the two. If you're trying to invent incontrovertible national history, wouldn't it make sense to get the story straight first and then write it down? Seems to me like someone must have collected stories from earlier time." Now let's suspend that. I know that you might want to bite on that, Russell, but hold on just a sec.
Sure.
And I have to give a shout out to my good friend, Dr. Scott Heffler. This is the final one from Dharma Defender, who said, "Dr. Heffler, you're pretty accomplished yourself. Very interesting specialty." So I thought I'd give a little prop out to Scott there. And I want to welcome everybody back to episode number 2. Like I said, it's an honor to have you back, and I think it was a very stimulating conversation. Russell, are we still playing by the same chronology? The degradation of your voice, is this still the litmus for how long we have you this evening?
Yeah, I think so. Probably a good hour. I have to remember. Well, anyway, I had a damage to my stomach lining.
Oh, no.
And then that created some acid that went into my voice box. And so, in the space of 2 years' time, it's like sometimes I sound like an ancient old man, with losing my. 2 years ago, I was fine. Half the time, I'm fine. But so we'll see how long my voice holds up.
In the meantime, just enjoy the gravitas that it gives you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, why don't we jump into that comment? It seems a good place to start. Russell, do you want me to repeat the question at all, since I have it in front of me?
I think I have it.
Okay.
The basic idea is, wouldn't it have been better to have one consistent story, work that out ahead of time, and, it would make it more convincing and compelling instead of having all these different contradictory traditions that were kind of patched together. I agree. That would have been lots better. I'm with the person who wrote comment number 3. But you have to deal empirically with what you have. And what you do have is you have all these contradictory doublets, and they're all varied, and someone wove them together. And evidently, maybe they were under time pressures. Maybe they had to coordinate between different groups, all of which wanted their story in, and nobody wanted to be canceled, in 270 BC. They were against cancel culture. I don't know. I hate that term, actually. So, but I mean, that's just the way it is. And the notion that you can raise this as an objection and therefore the Alexandria scenario is somehow undermined, well, I don't think that we're in that. The same problem exists with the documentary hypothesis. And even worse, you have the Yahwist in 900 BC or whenever, then the Elohist in 800 BC, and then, the Deuteronomist in 614 and P in 450. Each one of them, allegedly, they had all the other contradictory versions in front of them. And they didn't go like, okay, our beliefs are totally different than these other guys, but we're going to preserve all of that. We're not going to overwrite. We're not going to just have our own version. We're just going to add a little bit here and there. Why did they do that? Why did the redactors preserve conflicting traditions. That is as serious or worse of a criticism of the documentary hypothesis than the idea that someone made all these different sources play nice together in 270 BC. To me, that's less problematic. It is a problem, but it's a problem under every scenario, and I think it's worse under the competing scenarios.
Let me jump in real fast, because it's worth noting that even in the New Testament, we have this problem, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. He's sort of notorious for doubling up on characters, and scholars are thinking that he's doing it in an attempt to have his cake and eat it too, as far as not leaving anything out from any of his sources or his.
There's a good example where you have 4 Gospels that are contradictory and contemporary. Everyone agrees they are effectively contemporary, and yet they contradict each other on all sorts of points.
Well, and they're certainly dependent on all of them on Markan priority, but that's a whole other episode we can get into. Well, let's talk more about your criticism of the documentary hypothesis, because the thing that I find the most fascinating about your work is how the ramifications for the dating of the Old Testament. It just blows my mind how much more recent the Old Testament seems to be, even when you take into account that it's patchworks of other things. The final forms are so much later than anybody's ever suspected.
In fact, with the Pentateuch, they're as late as you can conceive of. I was surprised. I was shocked in my Berosus and Genesis book when I discovered, the Pentateuch was written after 285 BC because of Manetho. And it's after 280 BC because of Berosus, and was after, and I pushed the date clear down to 272 to 273 BC, which is right on top of the Septuagint translation. Yeah. It's like, it's pushing it right to the limit.
Yeah.
You can't go any farther than that. And so after I had written virtually my entire book, and I was contemplating that whole that amazing coincidence? No, because it finally occurred to me that the authors of the Pentateuch were also the translators. So it was the same event. The sources could be found at Alexandria. We know that the authors of the Pentateuch could read Greek because they had Greek sources, but they were writing in Hebrew. So they were bilingual, which is kind of a precondition for a translator. You have to know both languages. So all of that convert, and multiple authors too. All of that converged with the possibility that the authors were the translators.
Yeah.
And then you have the tradition in Pseudo-Auristius, the Letter of Auristius, that claimed there were 70 translators at Alexandria. Bunches of scholars from Judea and Samaria who came to Alexandria to produce this amazing translation. Well, that goes along.
And all of them, of course, did it on their own separately, and yet when they put it all together, they all agreed with it.
Word for word.
Every word.
Exactly the same. So in actuality, Septuagint scholars have detected maybe 2, maybe 3 translators in the Septuagint, because they've compared the vocabularies. And so if there's like 3 translators, why do you have this tradition that there are 70 scholars who arrive at Alexandria to produce these, translations?
A very coincidental number that keeps showing up in the Old Testament too, by the way.
That's true. Yeah, so to me, that was more consistent with multiple authors that you see in the Pentateuch, Jedph, and maybe a few others, because, Abraham versus the kings of, Genesis 14, that doesn't fit with any of the sources. So you have other stuff too. But yes, there are the number 70. There are allegedly 70 translators at Alexandria, who Pseudo-Auristius said that they were elders. They were Jewish elders who were very conversant with Greek classics as well as with Jewish legal studies. So you have 70 elders, and you have the 70 elders at Mount Sinai. Pretty amazing coincidence.
Yes.
Yeah, unless, as you believe, as I do, that this 70, they wrote themselves into the story. We received the divine laws at Mount Sinai, basically.
Yeah.
And you don't have 70 elders at Gerousia, a senate of 70 people, earlier than the 270s BC, as a Hellenistic era institution, a change in their constitutional features of their government. So here you have in the 270s BC, for the first time, you have a Jewish Senate that's ruled by a high priest, that's composed of 70 elders traditionally, and they show up in the Book of Exodus
as if they had been there the whole time from the very beginning.
The whole time, and they also show up as the 70 translators at Alexandria, and Philo refers to this annual celebration of the Jews in Alexandria of the 70 translators who Philo says were just as divinely inspired as the original 70 elders at Mount Sinai. There's another remarkable correspondence.
Yep.
What do you think? What do you think the 70 is for? Or two questions: do we know any of the 70? Like we could say we know 15 of them, or we know none of them, or and what do you think? Is there any significance to 70?
Well, we have. I think we have 69 or 70 names in Pseudo-Auristius, but obviously they're all fictional.
Yeah.
But yes, you had traditions that the Jewish Senate was composed of 70 or 71 or 72 members. 70 plus the high priest that was the ruler of the Gerousia, the Senate, or Sanhedrin, it was later called.
Sure.
So the 70, which gave their name to the Septuagint translation, that's basically a synonym for the Jewish Senate. In the Greek world, it was very common for the institutions, the ruling institutions of a Greek government, especially we know at Athens, to be called by the number of people in it. There was the 400, that was one of the councils. And there was this and that, there's at least 5 or 6 examples that we know of. And we also know that the 400, which was one of their assemblies, there were actually 401 members. So they like the round numbers. All of them have round numbers, even though usually there was maybe an extra member as a tiebreaker. So I take the 70 to refer to the Jewish Senate. In other words, the Senate authorized the creation of the body of Mosaic laws and the creation of the Torah, the books of the Pentateuch. It was their project. It was an official project, and that is why when the Pentateuch and the laws of Moses were written, they were instantly authoritative because the Senate and the high priest backed it entirely. And then this is really, does someone want to throw in a question? Because I talk just nonstop.
Well, it's great stuff. I did have a question earlier before we get too much further on here. And that was, all this comes out of Egyptian sources and Babylonian sources that you've come across. How did you stumble on Manetho and Berosus?
Berosus, I stumbled on, almost literally. I heard someone on a YouTube say, literally, they did this and such figuratively. So, no, I was in the University of Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, in their library. Because before the internet was so great, I used to go on raids to university libraries up and down the West Coast. Berkeley is my favorite. you've ever seen it or visited it, it's a fortress of learning. It looks
really
like a literal fortress. I love the architecture.
Yeah.
And I'd go there and I'd have a list of books I wanted to research. And then I'd go get them all off the shelves and stack them up on the photocopier and just photocopy the heck out of them. And that's how I did my research back in the day.
Oh, I feel your pain.
Yeah. So I was at the University of Oregon Library, and I was researching for a book called In Search of the Pillars of Hercules. Greek myths talked about pillars of Hercules at the Straits of Gibraltar and at Mount Caucasus and in India. So anyway, I was looking for all my sources for that. And and there's a reference in Berosus, who's a Babylonian priest who wrote around 278 BC. And I found a complete book of all the fragments of Berosus at the University of Oregon, photocopied it, front cover to back cover, read it, and it was just amazingly like Genesis. Actually, Genesis through Kings. I mean, it had the flood, it had creation, it had the 10 patriarchs before the flood that lived amazing amounts of time, had the flood story, all the kings after the flood down to his own. So I literally did stumble across that.
Wow.
But
Similar story with Manetho?
Similar to Manetho. You see, I thought, yeah, there's some kind of relationship here. Berosus definitely did not read the Bible. Why do they resemble each other so much? And then it wasn't until I read Niels Peter Lemke's book suggesting that the Pentateuch could have been written as late as, the Septuagint translation, that I realized the Pentateuch could have used Berosus, and then I really took off on my research. Manetho was sort of similar. It just occurred to me one day, well, how do we know that Manetho was copying the Exodus instead of vice versa?
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. It just sort of snowballed from there.
It makes me wonder how many other ancient sources out there are waiting to be discovered that have more to bear on our Old Testament.
Yeah, at the time I looked at Plato's laws, and I saw a few correspondences, but I really didn't make a whole lot of connections. And oh my God, laws, the most boring subject on earth. I just couldn't even go down that road. And
have you read? Just real quick question before we go too far. Dennis MacDonald's work on the New Testament and Homeric connections to that. I was curious about your feelings about how those hold up for you.
Well, I'm familiar with his thesis in his books. I haven't read them yet.
Gotcha.
I'm trying to think if I've ever read a summary. There are oftentimes literary tropes, a story pattern. It's like there's 10 plots in movies. There were
yes.
10 plots and stories in the ancient world too. And Homer, beat everyone else to most of them. So it doesn't surprise me that there are parallels.
Yeah. Especially given that the evangelists all seem to have Greek educations, very excellent Greek educations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hey Russell, are you with the majority when it comes to Homer that it's a multiple author product, or is it unique enough that you think it's from one mind? What's your thoughts on the authorship of the two epics?
Well, I think most of it is from one author. There's the catalog of ships, which is kind of a sub-document within the Iliad. And I think there's probably a pretty good case that was some pre-existing something or other. So, so I'm open to the possibility. And I haven't read more than a couple books on the subject, 2 or 3. But my feeling is that, the Iliad was one author and probably the same author as the Odyssey. And an amazing genius, he had to write all of this to memorize and recite orally because they didn't have, a written language at that time.
Yeah.
So you have to wonder how many Greeks were wandering around Asia Minor who could compose an epic poem of 40,000 lines. Two or three, maybe just one. Maybe he was a unique genius.
Yeah. Well, just to pitch in on that, apparently there's portions of the Iliad where there's anachronisms, where at one point they've got bronze weapons, and another point they've got steel, that kind of thing, which lends a little more suggestion that there was multiple time frames we're talking about. Much like Isaiah, much like the book of Isaiah, where we've got first Isaiah, second Isaiah, third Isaiah.
That could be, but there's also the scandalous fact that, Homer was their greatest author, and booksellers would, they'd have a copy of Homer and sell it, as many copies as they could. And every one of them was free to change it as much as they want. There were additions, deletions, all sorts of changes to the text. It wasn't until the 270s at Alexandria that textual criticism arose in order to create a good, solid text of Homer.
Yeah.
Well, so there's also the possibility that some of those differences might have been introduced by copyists.
Sure.
But I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other.
Same. Scott or Daniel, guys have any questions before I dive in?
Well, yeah, I have a bunch of questions. One is...
I love the way that you can tell when you're thinking. You look up and you get deep thoughts there. You must have a PhD to be thinking that hard about something.
Well, so I guess my first question is, what are the biggest controversies today in New Testament scholarship? Now, Russell, do you do New Testament or whole Bible scholarship? What's your interest?
Yeah, I do.
He skews to the other side.
I do lots of New Testament, but it's like Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson mentioned there were certain mysteries that the world was not prepared for, that he didn't want to have written about during his lifetime. So I'm kind of in the same position. I've got a book on the historical Josephus and the historical Jesus, another one on Josephus and the historical Paul. I think it's going to wind up being an article, but it was going to be a book called Jesus the Astrologer, which is it's a controversial, the title is supposed to be controversial, but it's basically looking at the Olivet prophecy and pointing out, along with the book of Revelation and other things, that the author was talking about omens, terrestrial omens in the sky. There were omen watchers since Mesopotamia and down through the Greek. And these guys were sky watchers. They said, look to the skies, you'll see the signs of your salvation coming. And comets and portents and, volcanoes, ash going all over them, and stars falling, you name. But they were omen watchers. They said when you see, you'll see armies coming in the sky. Josephus, one of his omen people, said the same thing, that there was one of the signs that Jerusalem was about to fall was there was a brilliant sunset, and in the clouds they could see armies in the clouds. And this is the exact same sign in Josephus and in the Olivet prophecy. So anyway, I was going to go into some of this omen watching background. That was a form of prophecy back then. And, so I have lots of New Testament stuff, but I haven't published yet. Although I do have an article coming out on the crucifixion week. So I've worked out the chronology, the events surrounding the arrest and crucifixion that reconciles the Synoptic Gospels and John, all the famous contradictions. I've pretty much got them sorted out. And it has implications for the dating of Jesus' lifetime too. But that's going to come out at some point in Revue Publique. And I guess I can't say too much more about it until then. But I have a lot in my back pocket.
I'll be looking forward to those. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So, so I guess I was wondering. So you started off with an interest in doing what do they call it? Historical critical interpretation of the New Testament. But because you saw this connecting to everything in the background, you decided to also look at translation times for the Septuagint and all this other stuff, and influence from Babylonian myths, and it just spread out. So I'm just curious about your personal journey. So it started off with a particular interest, and it spread backwards, like I guess it usually does for historians.
Started off with werewolves. No, I was studying. I love all sorts of mysteries in the ancient world. Greek literature, biblical, you name it. One of them was werewolves, lycanthropy, which was a phenomenon in ancient Greece. A lycanthropy was, when a man turned into a wolf. And there are several sources with respect to that. And I looked at all the sources, and I deduced, I think I solved the mystery that these are references to rabies in ancient times, as well as Kerberos the hellhound, dripping poison from his fangs, hiding in a dark cave, and if he bites you, you're a goner. So they had encounters with rabies back then. When you have rabies, like evidently I do, you start losing your voice, sounding like an animal, and you start to growl. You can't drink water. Oh, I guess I don't have it.
Well, this werewolves idea is the second.
You're also photophobic, so you have to hide in the dark. So anyway, that was their explanation, that a person was turning into a wolf or an animal. But anyway, so I studied all sorts of mysteries, and it just happens that some of the best of them are in the biblical world and religion. Religion has a surfeit of mysteries, which normally people don't want you to solve,
Yeah.
because otherwise they'd be out of business. Yeah, but I like looking at some of those mysteries and getting to the bottom of them. Sorry if that wasn't a very respectable answer, Scott.
No, that's a great answer. I just thought, I don't know why I thought this. I guess because Ehrman and some other people began as Christians, and they say, well, I'm really gonna please myself by combining rational evidence with the heart-led faith, and then they find out that the rational evidence is poor, and then so it wasn't an interest in religion that started it. It was interest in mysteries generally, and then you just sort of moved over to the hot spot of biblical mysteries.
Yeah.
Nice.
I did go to a Bible college back in the day, but I did something that we weren't supposed to do. I read outside of their, church library or whatever. Something that I always recommend. Don't get into an echo chamber. Okay. Don't get your facts and the interpretation of the facts from the same people. Don't learn, evolution from your pastor, or go outside your comfort zone and find out from the actual authors of these theories what they say, not what your people say that they say. So I educated my way out of that.
Nice.
And, and there's whole decades when I I forget that I ever went to a Bible college. It's a different person. Back when I was a teenager, so that's an excuse.
Daniel, do you have a question? I thought I cut you off earlier.
Well, I know maybe you're chomping at the bit. I want to maybe at some point tonight, I'd love to hear about the Astraguli, Plato's.
Oh, yeah. You'll have to back up for the general audience and explain what you're talking
Yes,
about.
You may give the explanation.
Okay, so in Plato's Lysias, I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a dialogue on friendship, and this is a later Socrates. He's an older Socrates. He's talking to the younger generation. The feel of the dialogue is there's sacrifices going on, like some sort of games or some sort of activities in the square. And there's a mention from Socrates that other youths are playing bone dice. Yeah. And these are effectively games of chance. I have one here.
This is what I want to see.
This is
look at that.
An astraguli. Now it's
a
not
little closer, Daniel. We're not seeing it. It's disappearing. There we go.
So what's really fascinating about this for me is that it's got the probability, not like a dice, a 1 in 6 chance rolling it. You roll it and it mimics the Pareto ratio. So it's 80-20 in terms of how it lands on the surface area. So it's got 2 larger surface areas and 2 smaller surface areas. Now, what they used to do in these ancient games of chance is they would roll the dice, and if they all rolled and they were different, then this would be called a Venus throw, right? I don't know how many there were. I think there was 5, which is odd to me because there's only 4 positions that it can land in. So how they could all be different, if there's 5 dice, it doesn't make sense. To me, it would be 4. But anyways, I think it's very fascinating that this is how the psychology of probabilities was an omen, maybe, almost, if you could kind of think of it that way. The Greeks could see that there was truth in these throws and in this game of dice. So my concern, Russell, was that, and I get this as I read Plato, is that a lot of it's been translated by biblical scholars that have a background in Christianity, and I think they skip certain things or they introduce certain words that don't resonate with a Greek origin. And when dice is characterized to me as something as a odd or even, it's confusing to me if the actual games were more of a 80-20 ratio. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's what confuses me about the way the translation comes up. And because if that's the case and it's not authentic to what the actual Greek says, then it makes me skeptical and sad in a way that this is what I'm reading, that it's not really truthful or representative of something that's so rich, if that's fair.
Yeah. Well, I think there may have been more than one variation of the games of knucklebones, which were played by women and children mostly, according to the sources. And different playwrights said that they had different origins, some from the gods. Plato said knucklebones came from Egypt. Some of them appear to have been games with dexterity, where you throw the dice and then you pick something up real quick. Kind of like jacks, where you throw the jacks and you pick up the ball. And so they had more than one game with those astrology. Is that what they're called? Astragoli, my mistake. But yes, the chance aspect is the gods could control that. And I think that they had more than one person throwing the dice at the same time. And so the winner had to do with if they matched each other or they were different or something like that. I think modern scholars aren't quite sure how it's played, but these games with dice are all over the world, and so I think they use some modern versions or later descriptions to try and figure out what's going on. But it could be taken as a form of loss, a form of the divine. The gods would determine how the dice were rolled. Plato talks about writing a constitution as a game of chance.
Huh.
He said, it's a game for old men. You write the laws of a colony. Whether it's going to work or not is a throw of the dice.
Right.
You hope you're going to win, but you can't guarantee it.
Right.
So that's all I know on that subject. I'm not really an expert, but translations that's a problem. There's you get a filter. The information is filtered through the translator. The Septuagint was that way too, of course, and you guys all know how information from the Old Testament was filtered through the Septuagint translation, so that you have a virgin may conceive is going to conceive rather than a young maiden. The word translation is almost incorrect. Every translation is an interpretation. It's a rewriting in another language. And you have to take into account the biases and filters and agendas of the people doing translating, as well as the actual linguistics involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not to mention the puns and the wordplay and things like gematria. What were you going to say, Scott?
First, I was just that I'm looking forward to the solution of the John's account of the Passover time versus the synoptic accounts. Because that, for me, was the most exciting part of the Ehrman's introductory lectures that he did for the teaching company. They moved the date back 24 hours so they can make Jesus into the slaughtered lamb. I thought, oh my God. And he goes, and that lets you know that the writers were prioritizing theological ideas over historical accuracy. When I heard that, the scales fell from my eyes and I started weeping because it was so well done. So I can't wait to hear your solution to that problem. Yeah. And the other thing is divination. What an interesting idea. And as you were talking, I started wondering, maybe divination is something like a Hesiod element between epics. So back in the old times, you have this simpleton theism, but later on you have science, which is a kind of reading information off of nature. And between these is the divination moment, where it's you're not quite adult enough to do controlled studies, but you're not praying or taking drugs with the oracle. You're looking and poking around nature, so you're halfway there to using scientific interrogation. Kant says that the scientific method is putting nature on the witness stand and interrogating her. So before you get to that smart phase, you're in the other phase where you're like, look at the tea leaves, or back in the olden times, look at the way that cow shoulder bone breaks in the fire. And those were actually, my second semester undergrad, I took a class in divination. It was supposed to be on the I Ching, but it ended up becoming a history on the whole divination idea. And the teacher thought it was important that the I Ching is a digital method of divination, and this affected cultural thinking, because before that, it really was kind of moody and stuff. But then you have the dice method, which is not moody, it's discrete, and the I Ching method, which is also using discrete. And I thought that must be an exciting moment to see how permutations of discrete elements, even binary elements, if you have enough permutations, then you can have enough explanatory richness to meet almost any problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but isn't it a nice idea in divination? It's like nature wants to tell you something. You just have to look at the right place. You need to look at the bottom of a teacup. You need to look at the way the tortoiseshell is broken. Don't look at any random thing. Look at this rock that you smash.
That's exactly how it happened in Mesopotamia, which is, I would say, the birthplace of science. They had the Umanu, the scholars or scribes, and there were different varieties. Some of them looked at the omens in the sky, and they had reporters from all over the Assyrian or Babylon, the empire. If there was such and such if there was a comet or if there was an eclipse, and then all of a sudden you had an earthquake in Anatolia, they'd write that down, they'd send it in. The scholars collected all this empirical information, just catalogs full of correlations between sky events and events on the ground so that they could predict things for the king. So there was the omen literature, and they would read the patterns of oil on water. They would read liver, all of that stuff. It was a completely empirical, inductive method of doing science. They did not.
That's very striking. It shocked me to hear you say that they were just cataloging everything, because if you're really being empirical, you don't want to filter anything out a priori. So anything might be correlated to the loss of that battle on that day. So list everything around you in the area. That's an amazingly mature way to
birds, flights of birds or behaviors of animals. All of that stuff was all relevant. Terrestrial, celestial omens. And one of the features of this form of science is they didn't come up with a theory that could explain everything. The Greeks came up with hypotheses that would explain the data. And that wasn't really Mesopotamia. They were just data intensive. And as a result, they could predict eclipses, eclipses in the 19-year cycles of the calendar and all. That was all just raw empirical data that they were collecting. So they were very good at that method. It helps to have a terrified bureaucracy of scholars, scientists working under you, collecting all the data. I don't think a smaller scale operation would have worked. So, but yes, the history of science is fascinating.
Yeah, not everyone could be a Tycho Brahe. Remember, he voluntarily went underground and made those columns. I mean, but those are the real heroes, aren't they? Without those data collectors, you'd never see the curves that you wanted to fit. They're the real heroes.
Was it Kepler or Copernicus who used Tycho's laws? I was just watching a video the other day of Kepler's laws. I won't get into it, but yeah, I love science.
Jacob Bronowski did a history of science called the Ascent of Man, and he actually visits Tycho's underground telescope, which is just a little hut underground. What a great episode that is! And anyway, yeah.
Well,
sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
Well, one of my kind of favorite scientific episodes was Galileo's telescope that he brought to, I forget what city, but had a university, it had philosophers, it had other people. He couldn't get anyone to look through the telescope and see the planet. He finally had his dog look through the telescope because he wanted somebody to see those planets and their moons. And I feel the same way with some of my books. Plato and the creation of the Hebrew Bible, not one citation in a scholarly work since 2017. I've read scholars who have said, Stephanie Antonios or Ariane Naudet wrote a great review of this Plato book, but I'm not going to read it. It's, too far out of my upbringing and, my education, I guess. So I'm like, I just want to shake these scholars and say, look through the damn telescope, read my book, and then you'll know what the fuss is about. So, but that's okay. Future generations will read it.
This is true.
And you guys have read it. So that's good enough for me.
In the publishing industry, there's you get imprints, right? There's there's a certain imprint. A publisher will get another imprint, and I thought a great name would be posthumous publishing, just simply for that same sort of thing. There's certain contributions that just are not realized in a lifetime of a scholar, and that's not why you write them. That's not, and that's the true spirit of why you do it.
No, I'm writing for future generations, and you guys are part of the future, so that's a good thing. And some people won't even join the present, but
very true.
Now
Have
it's
you
David.
noticed any emotional changes in your scholarship experience due to the easy access of everything ever published on the internet through Library Genesis, which has every book and article ever written? So, because earlier you were complaining, or maybe it was David, like, oh, remember back in the old days, always you had to go to the library and you had to stack all the books up. And I started getting wistful and emotional because those are the greatest times in school, is to be a grad student and then walking around campus with a whole satchel full of intellectual capital, feeling like you were the most important person on campus because you were going to go dig through the stuff and discover something. And now you can't have that feeling. All you have to do is hit a button and then instantly gigabytes of information. A whole library could be on your computer in a matter of seconds. And then it's like, it doesn't make it interesting anymore. The emotion has changed.
Yeah, I know. I like, I walk around with my thumb drive and it's just pathetic, you know?
And it reminds me of the excitement that you get in a H.P. Lovecraft story, where it opens up with a guy going to an antique bookstore, and way in the back, it's all dusty. I mean, it's just covered in what is this? Abdul Hazred, what is this? And when I was a kid and I read that, I was like, I want to find a hyper-dimensional bookstore that doesn't really exist in this space and time, but happens to appear in a corner in some little bohemian area off in Prague. And then I'll go in there and discover something that will unlock the occult mysteries of the universe. That was my main fantasy as a child.
Yeah. Well, or you have Little Shop of Horrors, where they basically did the same thing. Yeah. I love those, lost, ancient tomes of lost lore or whatever in the Raven. I love to browse some of those old books. And the people from those times, they still speak to you across time through whatever they've written. So,
and people are still making discoveries. People are still finding manuscripts that have been overlooked. There's something in the news just a few weeks ago. God, I can't remember what it was. Someone found something, and then holy God, it was a work written by someone that they didn't know existed. It was some famous writer, and then it was just sitting in a stack somewhere, some library stack.
Yeah.
The
libraries and the back shelves of the university, that's where all the discoveries are waiting to be found now.
That's one great thing about actually going to a library like Berkeley. There were I'm saying 4 aisles on the Greeks. And it wasn't just the titles that I was after. I'd go on fishing expeditions. This section is great, and this title probably has something. And you get that in an actual library, and you don't get that in a virtual library. But you also don't get allergic in a virtual library. So there's that.
And of course, you're still hanging out with ravens, but just at the local Starbucks now.
Yeah. Just today.
Yeah.
I had a couple of them come by.
How are we doing on time, Daniel? I didn't want to, before I dive into anything else, I want to make sure we're not pushing our.
Yeah, David, you're being so polite. I mean, we're right at the top of the hour, so we're just going to kind of, feel Russell out and check, how he's feeling. And Russell, how are you feeling?
Well, I'm doing okay so far. Yeah.
Okay, David, you've been so patient, and I know you have a couple gems to unleash on your good friend Russell here. So,
well, actually, something came up when you and Scott were talking earlier, and it made me think about how, looking at the tea leaves and all that. It made me put in mind of Hebrew Gematria and how. And the Kabbalists who would look into the Old Testament, and the words on the paper were so important. And I can't help but think that's partially the reason that they were so loath to not leave anything out and double up. I'm wondering if that was part of the motivation for them to not worry about contradictions as long as they got everything on the page. But anyway,
that's an interesting theory. Yeah. I was wondering about people doing numerology with the biblical text, counting letters and this and that. And then we discovered there were so many variations, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls. No translation and no text that we have is actually the original. So to me, that makes the quest somewhat futile to begin with.
Right. But, I mean, it was a jungle for starters anyway, but yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. You know, if you don't mind.
You know, when you mentioned the 70 and the Septuagint, the 70 scholars who went to translate, as soon as you did that, I went online and I Googled Sefer Sefirot, which was Aleister Crowley's dictionary, where he took every word from the Old Testament and then arranged it according to its gematria value, which is just to count the values of the letters up. And the idea was that there was some metaphysical essence that the words that all add up to the same number share. And a famous example is Yahweh is 26, Yud Hey Vav Hey, but the word Achad in Hebrew is unity and is 13, and so God is unity in duality, because 2 times 13 is 26. And see, just that stuff like that's kind of fun, especially when you're young and numerology still seems plausible.
Yeah, yeah. But boy, once you start that road, it never stops. It just never stops.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
People have an infinite capacity for seeing patterns, you know, whether they exist or not.
Yeah.
Exactly. I was checking to see if there's anything special about 70, and it was very disappointing, so I didn't say it.
When I was in college, I read a book called Subliminal Seduction.
Oh, I remember. Yes, I've seen that book.
Yeah. So, you know, there's in advertisements, you can, if you look, you can see the word SEX. And you could probably find it in the books behind me if you arrange the letters just right. So, yeah, I was really good at finding that stuff. And actually, I was working in an advertising agency one time. I was just passing through, and I heard a couple of the advertisers talking about some subliminals they were putting in one of the products. So, you know, there's something to, but what did it for me was when I could find the word SEX in ice cubes at the salt shaker or in clouds, you know, either one. I was just too good at finding them. And, you know, the scientific experiment there, that kind of kicked that in the head for me.
And remember, the Harvard did one on backward masking, where they had 4 different groups. One group, they said nothing, gave them a pen and paper, they just played Stairway to Heaven backwards. The second group, they said, listen for something that sounds like words. And the third group, they said, listen for a message. And the fourth group, they said, listen for a satanic message. I guess you could predict what the results were.
Yeah.
The power of priming is pretty fascinating there, right?
Yeah, for sure.
David, you have to unleash. You have something percolating there, I can tell.
No, I really don't. But I do. Part of what fascinates me about Russell's work is the implications for the dating of the Old Testament. And I keep wanting to steer us back towards that because that's my personal bugaboo. I'm fascinated by that. Like in a nutshell, what are the oldest parts of the Old Testament that we can identify as far as book by book, not like sections of, like pericopes, but like, the old prophets, the minor prophets, the major prophets, that kind of thing. And how far back do you see it going, the completed books?
Yeah, well, you know, you have the books and then you have the sources that were used by the books. So if you want to get around to the oldest one is the Gilgamesh epic used in the flood story of Genesis. But, you know, you have the Acts of Solomon and you have the annals of Israel and Judah in the Book of Kings. You have, there were source documents that I think were authentic in some sense.
Sure.
Went back to Iron 2 times. You have some Egyptian Psalms that are in the Book of Psalms. You have Egyptian Proverbs. You have Babylonian materials. Well, you have Berosus, of course, in both Genesis and the Book of Kings, Second Kings. You have a Babylonian source document in Ezekiel chapter 1, a Marduk vision that was domesticated and turned into Ezekiel's vision of the throne room. You have something.
Oh, I just want to pause for a second. You said Berosus is in Ezekiel?
No. Well, Yeah, actually, but Kings, the book of
Book of Kings.
Yeah.
And by saying that, you're saying that Kings could not have been written before Berosus?
Yes.
It could not be written as old as we think it is, or most people think.
It had to have been written after 278 BC.
Yeah.
There's one very, very, very striking parallel between Berosus and a couple of verses in Second Kings, in the Hezekiah story, where they talk about when Sennacherib went back to his homeland, and then he was slain in the temple, and his two sons, and this and that. That's Berosus. There's a passage in Josephus, book 10, where it says, this is from Berosus, and it gives an account of Sennacherib and his departure after the siege of Jerusalem, and it gives all the details in Kings, but additional details that could only have come from cuneiform sources, which Berosus had for the time of Sennacherib. So it's really a smoking gun that shows that Kings drew on Berosus.
That's fascinating.
This is what's interesting. That fragment in Berosus from Josephus, you don't find it in the Muellers or Verbrugge's, or there's 4 different collections of all the fragments of Berosus. It's not included in any of them. Because they say, well, this can't be authentic because it's too close to the biblical account. It's circular reasoning. It's really the smoking gun, and it's excised from all the collections of Berosus because it's too pertinent.
What's the topic?
That's
the topic of the fragment that's missing.
It's what happened after this.
It. Yeah, they say Josephus says, and Berosus had this episode in the life of Sennacherib, and then they don't include the passage from Josephus. They say this passage is missing because what actually follows obviously comes out of Second Kings. So it's the self-censoring process.
And Scott, what passage he's talking about is after the siege of Jerusalem, Sennacherib went back home, and in the Bible, it makes it sound like he instantly goes home and is killed right after the siege.
Right.
The source is actually, this was 18 years later after the fact. So it's one of those things where the Bible is taking the story out of context, not people taking the Bible story out of context.
And it's talking about obscure events in Armenia and stuff that, how could these biblical authors have known about these local developments over there? But, those same events are in cuneiform sources that exist and that Berosus drew upon in other preserved fragments. So, but a lot of stuff of the interactions between the Sumerians or the Judeans with either the Assyrians or the Babylonians, that's not Jewish material. It comes out of Berosus. Sometimes they have the same odd sequence of Assyrian and Babylonian kings. Berosus has that in common with the Book of Kings, but that's because Berosus had this Babylonian slant, and so he omitted any Assyrian kings that weren't ruling in Babylonia as well. And so anyway, there's a lot of evidence, and it'll come out in the books that I'm working on. But there's scholars have traditionally assumed that the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible, currently in possession of the Jews, that it was written by Jews, by Judeans, because they own it now. So number one, created a kind of a bias against obviously some Sumerian or Samaritan materials in the Pentateuch, which is the majority of the Pentateuch is from the northern kingdom. You have 10 out of the 12 tribes are from the north. Judea, Jerusalem, they hardly get mentioned. So there's that. And then there's all sorts of Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian, other materials in the Jewish Bible that they borrowed, and they incorporated in their writings. And most scholars don't think like that. They think, it's a Jewish Bible. It was written by Jews.
Right. Never mind those Zoroastrians. Never mind the Uyghurs. Yeah. Daniel, you had a question?
Yeah. The 10 of the 12 tribes were from the north, right? So does this correlate with the last man standing thesis of Yahweh being the one remaining God that surfaces, and the rest of, like, did the tribes actually represent, like, kind of have their contender God they kind of throw into the arena, and basically Yahweh was,
you mean were there originally 12 different gods and he was the one that came on top? Is that what
I know there was multiple, but did they kind of correspond with actual tribes?
I don't think so. Archaeologically, the situation you have is, number one, polytheism. All of the people from Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judea, they were all polytheists. They had bunches of gods. But all of them had Yahweh as their primary god. For instance, at Kuntalit Ajrud, which is a site of the Negev from around 750 BC. There's a couple references. There's inscriptions found there as well as paintings. There's a painting of Yahweh and his consort, among others. And there's references to Yahweh of Samaria and his consort, and Yahweh of Teman and his consort, where Teman is, from the Negev desert. So Yahweh was the possession of, it was primarily the god of Samaria. And then secondarily, since Samaria ruled Judea for the geographical area of Judea for a long time, Judea as an independent kingdom only rose like in 735 BC. Before that, Jerusalem, Judea, all of that was ruled from Samaria, in my opinion. And the Sumerians, they exported Yahweh worship in all the regions that they ruled, including on their caravan routes to the Red Sea, which is where this site in the Negev is, including in Moab, including in Jerusalem, which was, Yahweh worship in Jerusalem was really a product of Sumerian culture, in my opinion.
Interesting.
Different nations had their patron god, their god that looked out for their interests, and Yahweh and his consort, they were the patrons for Samaria and, and later Jerusalem. And there weren't 12 tribes back then either. I mean, there's no ancient attestation that there were 12 tribes.
But this is another Platonic correlation you found. Yeah. He
talks about how 12 tribes is the ideal number.
Yeah. Oh, that was so amazing to see that. Yeah. I like that the idea of the nationalistic or cultural doctrine is something that is put together by chance, as you say, and then reinforced over generations, and it will be either adopted or not. But I think that's fascinating. That it's like we need some sort of unified Foundation myth. Yeah, that's quite fascinating. Hey, Russell, I want to kind of start edging towards a wrap up, only because it's probably respectful for mostly for yourself, but the show itself is called The Myth of Jesus, and I'm only gonna partially back you into a corner. I'm gonna give you a nice polite way out of this.
Yeah.
But before you came into the room, and we've heard this from David in many cases, David is just loud and proud to the world that Jesus was 100% completely a myth.
In my humble opinion.
In his humble opinion. I think you had mentioned you're working on something, so I won't, force you to put, reveal what you're working on in terms of a book. But how would you like to summarize that? Since this is the theme of the show, and David is really what has brought us together on this show, and it's what connected me when I read David's work. I was just left utterly convinced by his by his books. And I'll say simple books. No offense, David. It's not a pejorative, but it's very simple.
The accessibility is what I really fought for. So I'm happy to hear you say that.
Yeah, I thought this is great, and why has no one done this before? So, please, maybe say a few words about David's work, and what your thoughts are, and what your thoughts are about the whole project of mythology in as a whole.
Before we put him too much on the spot, I'm not sure Russell has read any of my books.
I haven't. Yeah. I know broadly, your thesis, yeah, and I've read descriptions of it. You're ranked as one of the top few Jesus mythicists who are, giving respectability to that whole enterprise. And I think it's a very worthwhile avenue of research to explore. I do. I think there's a historical core to the Gospels, but I think there's also a lot of myth. But I don't find a conflict between them. I'm hesitant to bring up this example.
This is really great. We'll build some suspense. People have to come back. They have to.
Are any of you guys particularly political?
I'm pretty sure we all skew in the same direction, but
Okay, so most people do, but not everyone does. But I just want to point out something interesting. In the last couple of years, we have seen contemporary unfolding in front of our eyes, a mythology developing.
Absolutely.
You had a cult of personality with true believers who were passionate in their, attachment to an individual, and then he got booted out of office. And since 2016, psychologists have said that he would not be able to admit that he lost an election. They thought he wasn't going to admit in 2016. But it all came to pass in 2020. But it's interesting that even though, he was, someone else was elected, the true believers are in full denial. They can't admit that they lost, because then they'd be losers, I think. I think that's the psychological. And so you had this mythology arising, in this year, right in front of us. Yeah. You had Trump in heaven flying around in Air Force One. You have people waiting right now, for this last 6 months or longer in Dallas, waiting for JFK Jr. to return.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So you can have historical events happening, and you can have a mythology that arises as, as a defense mechanism.
Yeah.
For those people who can't reconcile reality with their belief systems and their attachments and all of that. So, so that's how I am able to reconcile, developing mythologies and history. There can be a disconnect. They can both be going on at once. But the people who are creating the mythologies have a vested interest in skewing history and, fact.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that anyway, that's my observations broadly on the whole topic. I think the exploration of mythology is very valid and possibly fruitful, but I'm an historical detective, so I'm going to take that alternate route.
Well, this is a good point. This could be used for actual messaging now. If some of these barely left of center people on CNN or something mentioned this in passing, it might actually do some good. But before we close, I wanted to go back to one thing you were saying earlier before Daniel took us off in this area. These dialogues that Yahweh is having with his people, is this modeled on the Sumerian proto-Yahweh? Or is this something that have they already adopted him and they introduced their Jewishness? Or is this method of, oh, my people, there's supposed to be something, there's an exceptionalism to Judaism, right? In the normal understanding. This is the first time they really had a plausible God. These are plausible conversations. This is a caretaker God. This is the social ego. This isn't just one of these cheesy Zeus type gods. This is something that's really getting close to. So is this mode of God instructing his people in caring paternal ways an inheritance, or is this something that had a new development?
Before you answer that, Russell, I want to stop up this can of worms right now, because I can see that's going to take us all night. We're definitely have to have you back. We're definitely going to have you back another time. Maybe not next month per se, but definitely when your next books come out, and definitely when my next book comes out as well, because I would love to have those conversations with you again. But yeah, let's put a pin in that for now, Scott, because that's going to go on forever.
Well, if it's 51% yes, say yes. If it's 49% yes, say no.
Let me just say one thing to address Scott briefly. I just want to point out that in Plato's laws, this isn't exactly quite on point, but God revealed the laws to the lawgiver in Plato's laws, and then the lawgiver was supposed to assemble all the citizens in the new nation that he was forming and recite to them the whole corpus of laws, at the time of the founding of the nation. So that whole dialogue, that Deuteronomy, the whole plot of Deuteronomy was taken right out of Plato's laws. And so you have some Greek influences that go into the whole God, lawgiver, citizenry, people thing. But I'll leave it at that.
You can't have Deuteronomy without Deutero.
All right, that's it. And I think, like David had said, I think we'll plan to have you back once your next book comes out, and we'll call it the reveal episode. I think.
Okay.
There we go.
The great reveal, and we'll do our part by continuing to read your work and bring you out on a stage like this. And if you get the chance, maybe pick up David's book and throw it around when you feel like chewing on
We'll
something.
talk after the show.
Okay. Thanks, guys, and thank everybody. Thank the listeners, and until next time. This is David Fitzgerald, and this is The Myth of Jesus.
The Myth of Jesus with David Fitzgerald.